Adam is remembered for blaming Eve, but the mistake that destroyed everything came before the excuse. Before the fall fully unfolds, Adam is living in peace in the garden. There is no sense of crisis yet, no tension building in the background, no visible signs that the entire human story is about to derail over one conversation that should have been stopped earlier. Everything looks stable. Life in the garden is ordered, secure, and routine. The environment is calm. The boundaries are clear. Nothing in the scene suggests chaos. No alarms, no warning lights, no dramatic soundtrack hinting that the first human collapse is already warming up backstage. And that is exactly why the moment matters. The problem does not enter like an attack. It enters like distortion. Not force, not violence, not an obvious rebellion, just distortion. The serpent begins twisting what was already clear. The command itself was simple, but the conversation around it starts to bend. The words shift. The tone shifts. The line that once felt solid suddenly sounds negotiable. And that kind of problem is always harder to notice early. It is like when everything still looks normal, but the real damage has already started because the right person did not react at the right time. That is the energy of this moment. Most people think the story breaks when Adam blames Eve. That is the famous part. The loud part. The embarrassing part that has been quoted in arguments, sermons, and probably a few awkward dinner conversations for thousands of years. But the story breaks earlier. The serpent distorts. Eve listens, and Adam stays silent. That silence becomes the first major failure. Not the excuse. The silence. Adam is present while the distortion happens. He is not arriving after the damage is done. He is there while the conversation is bending, while the truth is being twisted in real time. And he does not stop it. He does not interrupt. He does not correct the distortion. He does not shut the conversation down. He lets it continue. And that small hesitation quietly becomes the crack that the entire story starts collapsing through. Because once the distortion is allowed to breathe, everything else gets easier. The boundary weakens. The conversation moves forward. The decision that should have been stopped early keeps drifting toward a much worse outcome. By the time the blame appears later, the collapse is already moving, which is why the first major failure in Eden is not the excuse Adam gives later. It is the silence that happens earlier, and that silence is what makes everything else in the story heavier. Because once the person who should have acted first stays quiet long enough, the damage has already begun. And this is only the beginning of the damage. Adam is the man who was there. He is not missing from the scene. He is not arriving after the damage is done. He is standing there while the truth is being twisted. He sees the conversation changing. He sees the boundary being pushed. And he does not stop the conversation while there is still time. He is the man who watched the fall begin and stopped nothing. That is the uncomfortable part of this moment, because Adam is not absent from the problem. He is present while the distortion grows. Eve enters the conversation. She listens to the lie. She stays in the discussion that the serpent is bending. And later, when everything collapses, she becomes the easiest person to point at. But before she becomes the target, she is simply the one standing inside a conversation that has already started drifting away from the truth. And Adam is right there. The serpent does not arrive with brute force. It does not begin with violence. It does not begin with open rebellion. It arrives with distortion. Just enough distortion to confuse everything. The words shift. The meaning bends. The conversation slowly moves away from what was clear. And that is where the real danger sits. The command was clear. The lie was subtle. And Adam let the distortion keep breathing. That is the central problem in this moment. The boundary was still standing. The conversation could still have been stopped. The line could still have been defended. But Adam does nothing that interrupts the drift. He sees the truth being twisted. He does not shut the conversation down. He does not stop the distortion while it is still small. He simply lets the moment continue. And that small hesitation changes the direction of everything that follows. Because once distortion is allowed to breathe, the conversation keeps moving. The boundary weakens. The decision drifts closer to collapse. This is why the scene feels so familiar. It is like watching a situation start to move out of alignment in real time and doing nothing until the problem grows too large. The warning signs appear, the tone changes, the conversation bends, and the person who should react first remains silent. That is Adam here. He is watching the truth being twisted. He is watching the conversation drift, and he does not hold the line while there is still time. So by the time the fall becomes visible, the distortion has already been allowed to grow. The collapse does not begin with the blame. It begins when Adam lets everything twist, and after that, the blame already comes in crooked. The fall itself turns the scene ugly very quickly. The boundary is crossed. Shame enters, peace disappears, and transparency disappears with it. That is the shift. Just moments earlier, nothing in the garden required hiding. The environment was open. Nothing needed covering. Nothing needed managing. The scene was calm, stable, and painfully simple. Then the boundary is crossed, and the reaction appears immediately. Shame enters the story the moment the line is crossed. The people who had just been completely exposed now suddenly feel the need to hide. The sense of peace that defined the garden disappears, and the instinct to cover and withdraw appears almost instantly. Transparency disappears. What had been open is no longer open. What had been clear is no longer clear in the same way. The atmosphere changes the moment the boundary is crossed, and that is where Adam's response becomes important. Because Adam does not run toward the truth, he runs to hide. That is the failure in the process. His first reaction to the error is not ownership, it is disappearance. Instead of stepping forward to face what just happened, he moves away from it. Instead of confronting the moment directly, he looks for cover. The instinct that appears first is not responsibility, it is hiding. That response reveals something about the pattern forming here. The mistake happens, shame enters, and Adam disappears instead of stepping into the truth. It is like when a mistake finally becomes heavy enough to feel, and the first reaction is not to fix it, but to hide it, justify it, and try to buy time. That pattern shows up immediately. The error is real, the shame is real, and the first response is avoidance. That is the process failure. The problem is no longer only the broken command. Now the problem is the reaction to the broken command. Instead of clarity, there is concealment. Instead of stepping into responsibility, Adam creates distance between himself and the mistake. And that distance changes the tone of the story. Because once hiding begins, the situation becomes heavier. The mistake has already happened, but now concealment joins it. The act itself was one failure, but the reaction becomes another. And the reaction is not strength. It is survival mode. Humanity had barely begun, and the first survival mode was already avoiding responsibility. That is the dry irony sitting inside the moment. The human story had barely started, and the instinct was already clear. Make the mistake, panic, and look for somewhere to hide. That is Adam here. The line has been crossed, shame has entered, peace is gone, transparency is gone, and instead of stepping toward truth, Adam moves toward hiding. That is where the process breaks down. And it gets even worse when the truth reaches him. This is the critical moment of exposure. Adam is cornered by the truth. Fear appears immediately, the hiding becomes useless, shame is exposed, and there is no clean way out. God confronts him. Adam does admit the fear. He says he was afraid. He explains why he hid. The fear is real and the hiding is real, but when the responsibility finally reaches him, he deflects. The fear is admitted. The hiding is explained. But when the responsibility arrives, Adam shifts the weight away from himself. That is where the blame turns crooked. Instead of standing inside the failure, Adam redirects the pressure somewhere else. The responsibility that should land on him bends sideways. This is the moment most people remember. It is like being confronted exactly at the point where everything broke, and trying to survive the moment by shifting the weight somewhere else. Not fixing it, not owning it. Just trying to survive the moment by moving the pressure. The fear is real, the hiding is useless, the shame is exposed, and the responsibility is redirected. The first man does not become more tangled when he makes the mistake. He becomes more tangled when the truth reaches him, and he still tries to escape it. The truth reaches him. The failure is visible. But the responsibility does not stay where it should. The blame comes out crooked. The confrontation exposes everything. The mistake is visible. The shame is visible. The hiding is useless. And the blame bends away from him. That is the climax almost no one faces properly. The truth reaches him, and instead of standing inside it, he steps sideways. That is the turn of the moment, and that is where the collapse becomes complete. After the fall, peace disappears. Shame remains, and a pattern is born that still looks painfully human today. That is the part almost no one highlights. Because most people reduce the story to the fruit, the mistake, the obvious moment when the rule is broken. But the problem was not only the fruit, it was the pattern that started there. Fail, hide, defend yourself, and push the blame away. That pattern begins the moment the fall happens. The peace disappears, the shame stays, and the human instinct to escape responsibility quietly enters the story. That is why the real story does not only show the first sin. It shows the first collapse of responsibility, and that collapse does not happen in one moment. It unfolds step by step. Adam fails in silence. He stands there while the distortion grows and says nothing. Then he hides when he is exposed. When the truth reaches him, his first reaction is not correction but concealment. And finally, he deflects when he has to answer. When the responsibility reaches him directly, he pushes the blame sideways. That is the full pattern: fail, hide, defend, redirect. And that is the part almost no one emphasizes, even though it is the most human part of the entire story. Because the fall is not only about disobedience. It is about how a human being reacts when the truth finally reaches him. The mistake happens. Then the silence. Then the hiding. Then the crooked blame. And by the time the blame appears, the collapse has already been building for a while. That is why the fall begins before the excuse. The excuse is just the visible moment. The real collapse starts earlier, and that is why the story still feels uncomfortably familiar today, because Adam did not fall only in the fruit. He fell in the silence, the hiding, and the crooked blame. Which biblical moment should I simplify next? Cain, Jonah, Samson,